Hello there, and welcome to this, the 211th edition of DF Direct Weekly, which is and shall always remain our weekly discussion show covering the latest gaming and technology news. No time for plugs. Let's directly introduce the panel. He's back from vacation and indeed illness. Not in that order, but hello, John Linneman.
Yes, it's been a crazy year. Illness, GDC, vacation, and I'm about to set off on another journey next week. So off to Japan for a month, but from there I should be able to join you guys for DF Direct. So
that's fantastic.
I'm happy to be here.
And also joining us, of course, Oliver McKenzie.
Yes, another big Switch 2 week of news and some Sony first-party updates. So it should be a fun time with you guys here.
Absolutely. Okay, but before that, please do visit store.digitalfoundry.net, the home of our merchandising wares. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, so this one came out of nowhere because we were kind of expecting to be able to have early access and a review, but Days Gone Remastered, quote unquote, dropped yesterday on the PlayStation Store, and as soon as it did, lo and behold, review code turned up in my inbox. And well, what can I say? Whenever a game arrives on review day, you kind of always expect the worst, don't you? But at the same time, with Days Gone, we already had the basis of a really good PlayStation 5 version in the form of a PC version, which is, I'm not going to say one of the all-time greats, but it's certainly a fantastic port. And it looks as though that's the basis for what's happening here. There's an assist from Climax Studios in there as well. But it's interesting to see the changes that they've made. Now, I took a look at this one, but I have shared assets with John and Oliver. Oliver, I'm going to go to you first. I'm curious what you make of this. I mean, I'm just going to go on the basics first because there's a lot to go through here. There are a lot of enhancements. We can only present first impressions. We do have an idea of what Ben Studio and Climax has done. And but yeah, this is basically a straight comparison here of the Pro Enhanced mode, which is operating at 1584p, upscaled with PSSR to 4K, targeting 60 frames per second. And I've compared that against the PS4 version running on the PS5 Pro, but with the Back Compat Plus enhancement, which means that basically the 30 FPS cap was removed. Curious about your first impressions there, though, Oliver.
Yeah, I kind of have mixed feelings on some of the relighting that they've done.
Yeah.
Like in this opening sequence, one of the kind of key highlights, technical highlights they've made here is they've darkened and I suppose made those nighttime scenes more realistic. But I'm not sure how I feel about that because I do like, I suppose, that they do seem like more realistic, like you get that proper fade off into pure darkness basically in nighttime scenes, instead of like that typical kind of gray cast that we so often see in games with the moon as like a really strong light source. But more realistic is not always better. And in some cases, you know, having that really strong light source and getting that kind of more diffused, very unrealistic looking nighttime sky actually serves a storytelling purpose. And I think arguably it served a storytelling purpose maybe in this original cutscene. And it serves a gameplay purpose, obviously, in games like this. Now, I think this darker sky extends to gameplay, and that's a curious choice as well, because, again, I'll have to see how this plays, but in Days Gone, it wasn't really a game built around, like, the scarcity of light or a horror-type game. It was very much an action game, where at night you had full visibility on all your zombie foes, and you could take them out fairly easily. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays, and it'll be interesting to see if that's ultimately a good thing for the gameplay and ultimately a good thing for the storytelling. Elsewhere, you know, the new version has a bit of a blue cast in some of these sequences. I kind of prefer that earthier tone. I must say, again, I'm not sure which one is necessarily more realistic, or, you know, they talk about having an improved atmospheric model here. Again, I kind of just tend to have a certain preference here, and I would have a preference for that earthier tone in that original title. But yeah, they apparently have made improvements. They've added the SSGI, the screen space indirect lighting from the PC version. They've improved the sky model. They've improved a number of things here. But overall, I'm not necessarily seeing a huge upgrade, although that's par for the course with these Sony efforts. At least here, they have gone to some effort to improve the lighting as they see fit, whereas like the other Sony remasters that we've seen have basically just been like resolution bumps and frame rate bumps and things like that.
Yeah, it does seem to be that they've put a lot of effort into this one, which I guess is an extension of some of the work done with the PC version. They're saying that the PC version Well, actually, the highest settings from PC have been deployed for PS5 Pro here. There's no checkerboard rendering anymore. There are three modes for the Pro: performance, quality, and this Pro enhanced version using PSSR. If you're wondering what the difference is between performance and enhanced, then basically the performance mode's basically 1800p, so you get a resolution drop with PSSR, but you are getting PSSR. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work that we need to do on this, but I just wanted to present some early impressions here. But yeah, I mean, the coloring difference may well be down to the new Sky model. Which they're saying is brand new. The old, they're saying here, this is a direct quote: the old system processed sky scattering calculations in the RGB color space, whereas the new system uses a 16-band spectral model, producing much more accurate color tones. The model also gets additional simulated effects like ozone absorption. I mean, this is pretty hardcore stuff. But at the same time, you know, it is essentially, if you can think of it as, well, let's consider like the original version as like high settings, if you like, and then this new version is ultra. Now, the key thing is that they did unlock the frame rate on the PS4 version running on PS5. So a lot of the heavy lifting that you'd want from an enhancement has already been done, which is exactly what we saw with games like Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2. I'm curious what you make of the assets there, John.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting to see it. I actually can appreciate what they're going for here. And when you compare, like, this kind of shows where games are versus like a film, right? Because it's real time rendered, you can make fundamental changes to the way the systems work, right? Like they've essentially gone back and relit the game using new technology. So it has a weird effect because it is arguably more accurate, but at the same time, you know, the artists clearly built the original designs and locales with that original lighting model in mind. So it's hard to say whether it's better or not. But I am actually interested in the whole change in the way nighttime works, because there is a horror element to this game, of course, and something I always appreciated in games like Dragon's Dogma is that nighttime was actually dark. The original Days Gone, that's not really the case. It has that typical kind of like almost bluish, grayed out look to it at nighttime, where it doesn't really feel like it's really dark in the forest. It seems like this one has changed that quite a bit, which I'll be curious to see how that plays out. I haven't had time to jump in myself, just based on the footage I'm seeing here, though, from you. It seems very promising, especially with HDR. Actually, is HDR supported?
Yeah, HDR is supported.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so yeah, combine that with HDR, it could end up looking really great. They also, you know, they've improved things like shadow map resolution is much higher as well. And yeah, it's like an interesting take on it. I'm actually happy to see different visuals rather than just like the same but higher res this time.
Yeah.
It kind of gives you a reason to revisit it more than usual, right? Like if it looks basically the same but sharper, then it's not really that interesting. It's just for people that haven't really played it. But here it's like, okay, this actually gives you a reason to kind of look at the differences and appreciate what they've done here. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I feel like Days Gone is one of those games where in time, the public opinion has kind of come around on it.
Oh, absolutely.
I always liked this game. I liked it from the beginning, and I was confused by some of the negative results when it came out. I was like, what? Wait, what? Because, you know, obviously, as you know, Rich, when we're dealing with embargo stuff, you're going in blind. Like occasionally you might talk to a fellow reviewer, but usually you don't really know where the public's going to land on this. You just kind of go with your gut. And I was like, wow, this is really good. And then it drops and you're like, oh, a lot of people hated it. I was confused. I think still today, what this does with the open world design is really fascinating. This idea of like the bike essentially makes it so that you have to plan out your journey across the landscape in a way. The idea that you can be driving and basically like, you know, run low on supplies and need to stop and get out and explore like a town and find stuff to keep going. I think that's really cool, and it kind of encourages the player to play a little differently. It's got shades of I would say something like this is something Death Stranding kind of did as well, where it makes the journey a larger part of that experience rather than just the A to B gameplay. So
Yeah, there was a lot of great stuff in Days Gone that obviously is still here because it's still Days Gone. But, if you think about this as a PS4 game, um, first of all, foliage is always really difficult to do. They did
Right.
foliage. They didn't just do foliage. They did rich foliage with like a horde of zombies.
Yeah, they did.
And that horde, bearing in mind they were running on the Jaguar CPU there,
Yeah.
is just kind of like, they were doing things that nobody else was doing, really. I think it's just a really impressive game.
Rich, I think through the passage of time, looking back, I feel like this game actually does stand alongside titles like Gears 5 as the most impressive Unreal Engine 5 games released, right? Both in terms of the console version and the initial PC release, where they sort of solve a lot of the problems that Unreal Engine typically faced with these kind of games, and did a lot of cool new things as well. So they really knew what they were doing.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, I mean, going back to that initial launch, there were some performance problems. Specifically, it seemed to be the sort of time-honored traversal issues, I think, but it was kind of solved, I think, by and large. And then once we got to the PC version, bearing in mind that Unreal Engine 4 wasn't especially kind to the PC versions of many, many games, that port arrived and it was, as best as you're going to get, I think. All of that work moves across to PlayStation 5 here, and to the point where it doesn't really feel like an Unreal Engine 4 game, which I think is quite remarkable. Yeah. And I think the other thing which sort of surprised me at the time was that it was a really good version of checkerboarding.
Right.
Especially bearing in mind the fact that it is such a foliage-heavy game, which is really, really difficult to get right with checkerboarding, which is why the comparison of the PS4 version running on PS5 against the new one kind of holds up pretty well in that regard, I think. So when it comes to whoever's reviewing it, I mean, I'm looking at the PS5 specs here, base PS5, bearing in mind that existing work, the PS4 version running on PS5, it doesn't go anywhere. It's still there. And the PlayStation 5 version, which they're asking like a $10 upgrade for, 1440p resolution. So that 1440p native versus 2160p checkerboard on the existing version, I think is going to be quite interesting. But then you've got the native 4K version as well, which runs at 30. And looking at the Pro there, that performance mode, as I said, 1800p, but there's also a 2880p, 5K native resolution 30 FPS mode as well, which I think is going to be fun to look at. I did take a quick look at performance because obviously, you want it to run well. I mean, it always did run well, the PS4 version on PS5, unless you went into like these challenge modes, the Horde Assault, which is what I'm using here to stress test. And it's pretty much still 60. There are some small drops, and they seem to come into two sort of varieties there. There is genuine GPU-related drops, I think, which are kind of more sustained. And then if you switch to the second test I did here, seems to be the case that when you initiate gigantic explosions, it seems to give the CPU pause as the carnage is kind of calculated there, which happened on PS4, on PS5 as well. But sorry, John, I interrupted you there.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to chime in and say that they also are promising a 40 FPS mode in a future patch. I'm surprised it's not there at launch, but I'll be curious to see if they can retain at least something with the quality super sampled mode in that mode, which would be nice.
I think what they're aiming for is 1800p on that mode.
Really? But that's what performance mode already is.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see what the changes are. Oh, no, that's the PlayStation 5 version, sorry. That makes sense, right? That makes sense. It's the midway point between 30 and 60. Pro, the balance mode is 4K with PSSR.
Right.
That's going to be fun. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why I'm curious to see. Oh, is it? We don't have that yet. I guess that's
no. It's coming in patch 1.03. So that's
it is a little odd waiting for features like that on a remaster, though, I must say.
Yeah, it's also getting VRR support as well, which is great. But again, you did kind of expect all of that to arrive on day one, really, didn't you?
Exactly.
VRR support, unlocked frame rates, Like, what kind of music am I hearing on that one? That could be a problem. So hopefully that's not an issue with this title.
Right. Okay. Yes, we never heard back from Sony. We did present our findings on that, but yeah, the VRR mode is still apparently unfixed. But it does seem to be on a title by title basis, Oliver. So, you know, let's spin.
I mean,
the
it could
wheel.
be fine. Hopefully
Yeah,
it's fine.
absolutely. But yeah, this is just a first look at this because literally the code arrived like lunchtime yesterday. So yeah, we've still got a lot of work to do. We still need to assign somebody to look at it in its full glory. But it is looking like a really good piece of work. A lot of effort has gone into it for sure. And yeah, $10 upgrade. It's not too bad, I don't think. Anyway, more on that soon. But for now, let's move on. Okay, we're going to be staying with PlayStation now. A new trailer arrived for Ghosts of Yōtei. And obviously, there's a huge amount of anticipation for this one. It's going to be arriving in October this year, which makes me wonder whether Sony knows something about the GTA 6 release date that we don't, because nobody wants to go up against that one. But let's go back to the trailer. Obviously, there were some mixed feelings about the debut trailer, right, Oliver? So I'm curious what you make of this new showing.
In a vacuum, I think this actually looks pretty good. There's a huge open world, great scale, the environments look pleasing, there's abundant foliage that stretches all the way into the distance. You know, these games, obviously Ghost of Tsushima had this trait as well. They do a really great job of keeping pop into a minimum and really kind of selling these extravagant views. And some of the shots I think here are quite stunning, like the foliage. You know, in this shot, it's drawing as far as the eye can see. The atmospherics and volumetric clouds are kind of breaking up that view and giving you a sense of real depth to the image, giving you a sense of distance. The little villages in the area are marked with little smoke trails, so the player is drawn to them. You know, those kind of classic open world tendencies here are very much in full display, but I think it looks terrific. And of course, you get that Mount Yōtei in the distance. And I think here that's going to be kind of the structuring landmark of this title that you can kind of orient yourself around in this world. Like, I imagine anywhere you are on the map, you can probably turn east, south, west, north, whatever, and see that mountain and kind of orient yourself in a real 3D space. I think that might be pretty cool.
The question, Oliver, though, you see that mountain, can you go there?
That's certainly a question. I would expect that you would be able to, and that would be part of the game's plot. That's my own personal guess based off of the fact that it's called Ghost of Yōtei. I presume that's part of it. But those are all things basically outside of that Mount Yōtei stuff. Those are all things that I liked about the first game, basically. And there are some other things about it, too, that are pretty cool, like the particle systems and the wind and all that nice stuff from the first game that was really kind of stunning in that first title. And here, I think we're seeing that as well. In terms of advancements over that game, though, I did spot a few things. I think the facial animation looks kind of nice here, at least in these sequences. You're getting that kind of stiffness in that first game, and here you're getting a bit more of that subtlety, like the slight narrowing of the main character's eyes in one scene, the twitch of the mouth, those kinds of nonverbal cues I think are coming across quite well. But I'm very curious to see how facial animation looks across this game, because like a lot of other open world titles, including the Horizon series, or at least the first Horizon game, there was a big difference in the quality of the high-end cinematics for the game's main plot. Huge, yeah. And the game's kind of secondary, lower tier quests, it was much lower. So hopefully that level of quality is being brought up to a more homogeneous level here. At least that's what I would hope. But I did manage to download John's original Ghost coverage, and I flipped back and forth between that video and this content that we have here. And I think that most of the improvements that we're seeing are probably in the of an iterative nature to scale and scope and maybe lighting fidelity and probably textures as well, because those were pretty questionable in the first game. Although I did spot some slightly questionable textures in this trailer also, so maybe some of those differences will be more evident in head-to-heads. But I think like one key concern, and I think this is what Alex was raising when we spoke about it some months ago, his kind of key concern here and a concern of mine as well, is that they aren't like trying to overhaul the game's lighting to solve rasterization issues in the same way that we see from a lot of other developers this generation. Like there's no VSM or RT shadows, no per pixel RTGI, I don't think, no RT reflections. Those are areas that we kind of expect first-party games, current-gen games to be pushing out this generation, and we aren't really seeing that here. Like if you look at a game like Intergalactic, which was obviously debuted just a few months ago now, that's a game that is using like VSMs or RT shadows, I believe, for their shadowing system. It looks quite good. They have like a really good solution for reflections there. The reflections look good. There's no occlusion issues. Like it kind of looks like T-Loop Part 2 Evolved, but then there's also these elements that are really kind of getting in there and showing some real progression in terms of the underlying technology. And they're also targeting 60 FPS. Now, this Ghost of Yōtei footage targets 4K 30, it looks like. At least it appears subjectively 4K, like I didn't get a pixel count on it. Hopefully it will be running at 60 FPS, but there's also a question of, hopefully you have a good 60 FPS mode, because otherwise why wouldn't you show off this game at 60? So I have some slightly mixed feelings in this footage. I think it still does look terrific, and relative to most of the games that come out these days, I think this is a really good looking game. I think it does look better than the original, but we're not seeing that same progression in technology that I think we're seeing from some other big AAA games in this space. And in particular, one game we might think of is Assassin's Creed Shadows, which obviously came out very recently, has that great RTGI, looks terrific, has some similar kind of wind and particle systems and nice stuff going on there. So I think that's another benchmark that this game is going to be measured against. And that game certainly has a lot of progression that maybe we aren't seeing as much with this title.
Mm-hmm. John, thoughts?
Yeah, from the first party stable, it definitely is interesting to look back at Horizon Forbidden West and then look forward at what we see with Decima and Death Stranding 2 and see how far beyond PS4 generation those games pushed. And this one really does not. This feels very much like just a continuation of what they achieved in the original. But at the same time, that also seems to be sort of par for the course with Sucker Punch's games, for better or for worse, where they'll sort of make that investment on the technology for the beginning of a series and then just sort of iterate on that for a while. Though, because games now take so much longer to create, they've now crossed into a completely different generation, right? Which was not the case in the past. So that's a little bit different. But I will say, so if they can keep the image quality up and deliver a smooth 60 FPS performance mode, I think the art direction and visual design is strong enough that it'll be fine. There is something to be said for having a very clean, pin-sharp looking game like this, running at smooth frame rate without a lot of the more modern, temporal artifacts that we often see, especially on consoles these days. So that it might end up looking really great as a result. Not necessarily pushing any boundaries, but delivering something that's just very striking to behold in its own right. And I think that's okay. I will say, though, you're right. Compared to something... I've been playing Assassin's Creed Shadows on the PC, and I mean, that does genuinely feel like a massive next generation leap visually, like a huge step forward in so many ways. And I can't help but draw comparisons as well, because the lineup of masked foes facing off against the protagonist, as things are, on fire around them in this cutscene here, it's suspiciously similar to the intro prologue in Assassin's Creed Shadows, if you recall, Oliver.
Yeah.
So I was like, wait a minute, this feels extremely familiar. I don't know, though. We'll see. I think, though, regardless of similarities, which are bound to happen given the setting, I think it's going to be a well-made game. I had my issues with the original, but it is extremely well made, and I think a lot of people loved it. And even if they're not pushing the boundaries forward, it's still going to be something that I think people enjoy. I just hope that they take what they've done and sort of fix the potholes. You already mentioned the animation stuff, right? Like on cutscenes, the dialogue sequences were very stiff in the original, outside of the main sequences. But there's also stuff like just traversal. If you recall, the original game lacked sort of like foot IK, inverse kinematics, which meant that when you're walking up terrain, the feet don't actually match correctly with slopes and stones. So it just kind of looked like you're using the normal running, walking animation all the time, no matter what the terrain looked like, which I always felt was a little bit weird because IK has been around for so long. I mean, even into the 90s, but you look at something like Shadow of the Colossus on a PS2 and it was all about that, right? You just didn't get that in that. And it always felt weird to me to have the character sort of glide over the terrain. So I hope to see something like that addressed. But, it does still feel like we're just in this sort of sparse zone of first party releases, right? And it is interesting. This came out around, was this like
summer 2020,
right? So this was actually after The Last of Us Part 2.
It was.
And we're still years and years away from Intergalactic.
Yes.
I mean, we know Naughty Dog has had some issues with that Last of Us multiplayer game. But it is interesting how those two games basically released concurrently, and now we have this sequel on the horizon arriving this year. And there's nothing to be seen for Naughty Dog for quite some time. So
yeah, interesting. I've just got some quick thoughts on this. I just think, what can I say? It's a cliche, but the kind of cinematic approach is something that they just did extremely well in the first one. It looks as though they've managed to carry that over and enhance it, indeed, based on this trailer for this new one. Character rendering does look significantly better. But there is this odd divide in this trailer where, obviously it starts with the cinematics and then you cut to the gameplay and it feels like almost two different games. So it's going to be interesting to see how they sort of merge up. And yes, fighting a bunch of masked dudes in a fiery surrounding. It's unfortunate there is that comparison with Assassin's Creed Shadows, but it is worth saying that, Sucker Punch wouldn't have seen Assassin's Creed Shadows when they created that. There's no sort of quote unquote copy going on here. It's just
no.
It's just an unfortunate sort of comparison really that's arised. I mean, I can't really add too much more to what you guys have already said. Still feels like something isn't quite there, but at the same time, that cinematic direction and the kind of epic nature of it certainly is, and the style that they had for that original game was kind of unique, and I think it still is unique.
I actually recommend you guys click on the E3 2018 debut gameplay for Ghost of Tsushima, because it is interesting to look at that through fresh eyes and say, like, in some ways that original demo still looks either on par or better than what we're seeing.
Right.
Somehow. I was actually there for that conference. I think that was the last one that Sony put on at E3. And I remember they ushered us into this large sort of stadium seating style room with a huge screen stretched across in front. And you just had like the grass blades blowing, like waiting for the audience to arrive. And then once they kicked us in and started showing the gameplay, I think a lot of the reaction in the crowd was like, wow, is this our first taste of PlayStation 5?
Right.
Right? Like that was the reaction. Everybody was like absolutely stunned by what they saw. And obviously as a PS4 game, it was extremely impressive in many, many ways. But yeah, it's starting to show its age a little bit, but I got to say, looking at that demo right now from 2018, that was pretty sharp looking.
Yeah, there's like that. I totally see what you're talking about now. There's like that classic, on the horseback, galloping at speed, going through fields of like wheat little flowers everywhere. That looks stunning. And that looks stunning in Ghost of Yōtei as well. Yeah. To me, there's never a question about can they depict large scale spaces at scale looking absolutely stunning. There's no doubt about that. To me, the question is just like, what about everything else? Yeah. And that's kind of, I don't think we necessarily see a lot of that in this trailer. We do see some improvements to facial rendering. That's certainly welcome. But like, are we going to see dodgy textures? Do they have IK in there? Do we have, even things like, I remember the enemies in that game didn't have any like physics-based animation when they died. So you just kind of slashed at them and they'd fall in canned ways. Is it always going to be canned, or is there going to be some physics component to it? Lots of these areas where that first game wasn't necessarily 100% up to par, although it did look very beautiful at times. Will those be improved? I'd like, beyond like complaining about ray tracing or whatever, which is what I want to do slightly, I'd love to see some improvements in those areas as well.
Looking at this though, I do think the shadow resolution is much higher in the new game. You can see shots where they show like the light filtering through her hat like very smoothly on the face, and there's actually detail depicted in the shadow. And looking at the original here, the shadows are quite a bit lower res overall, so that's good.
Okay. Well, we're going to be following this one with much interest, Palpatine style, as we get closer to release. But with that, let's move on to our next news topic. Okay, so we're moving ever closer to the release date of the Nintendo Switch 2, and there's new pieces of news emerging virtually on a daily basis, and we're going to go through a bunch of them right now. And some of them are quite controversial, as seems to be Nintendo's want. We're going to kick off with this one. Now, we've just talked about Days Gone Remastered being a $10 upgrade for owners of the existing game. And that's kind of like an established precedent, right? The game is actually available as a full price release, but if you already own it, then you get all of the enhancements for a $10 upgrade via a PlayStation Store purchase. obviously, Nintendo is following suit to a certain degree with the Switch 2 edition versions of their game. But here's the thing. It turns out that there isn't going to be a flat upgrade cost. It's going to be priced individually per game. So, for example, Tears of the Kingdom, that is going to be a $10 upgrade, right? But it's actually much, much higher for Kirby and the Forgotten Land and Super Mario Party Jamboree. I'm just looking at the UK prices here, courtesy of Video Games Chronicle. Zelda, £8. Kirby and Super Mario Party Jamboree, £17. That's looking like a $10 upgrade in the US for Zelda, $20 for those other games. I don't particularly have a problem with charging an upgrade fee because I do think that there is value in these upgrades. Obviously, the way Microsoft did it is the most consumer friendly of all. Just, roll out a patch, doesn't cost anything, and your existing games look better. That's fantastic. But I do understand the commercial reality of work having to be paid for. John, my concern here is that this is going to result in consumer confusion, and some of the pricing may seem a bit illogical. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, pricing around the Switch 2 stuff has been a bit all over the place so far, in addition to the rather high price if you were to buy these new at retail, which Zelda, for instance, sells above the price of the original game on Switch launch day, which is curious. But I think what they need to communicate perhaps better is what has been added to the game. Yeah. So in the case of Kirby, for instance, it seems like they've added quite a lot to the game. It's not just Kirby and the Forgotten Land. There seems to be a lot more there, which I think is really great because I love that game. Whereas Zelda looks more like there's like some quality of life stuff, performance upgrades, the typical stuff you expect from a $10 upgrade. So they just kind of need to make all that, I think, very clear to the customer, and that's maybe where they've struggled a little bit so far in terms of making that obvious. And something like Mario Party Jamboree as well, I think they've added content there from what I can tell. Rich could tell me more. I mean, every time I see Rich online on the Switch, he's playing Mario Party Jamboree. He just can't seem to stop playing it. So you'll have to tell us more about that, Rich.
Yeah, I do that while dodging the dust on my Switch. Yes. Yeah, somehow I'm managing to play these games while keeping my Switch fully dusted up somehow, which is typical of lack of use, but seemingly not, according to you.
It is interesting, though, to see this kind of stuff, because technically, is this not the first time Nintendo's engaged in this sort of structure, right? Like, we've seen plenty of releases of games from prior generations on new machines, right? Especially with Switch and Wii U. But now, for the first time, they're actually offering these sort of upgrades. And it seems to vary per publisher. It seems like some games may actually have free updates. Others will have paid updates. I think Sonic and Shadow Generations is confirmed to have a paid upgrade.
Right.
They're doing that as well. So, that one seems a little bit more egregious considering that the original just came out last year and was a little bit subpar. So...
Yeah, I mean, I was worried about Switch 2 from the perspective of the fact that Nintendo has run out of games to remaster from the Wii U era, essentially. And that was actually instrumental because it enabled them to flesh out the first-party lineup. And the original Switch benefited immensely from that.
Oh, yeah.
You essentially had an entire generation of games that very few people had actually played. But that wasn't that they weren't great games. It was just that people weren't particularly interested in the Wii U.
Nobody bought the Wii U.
So it seems that the strategy for this generation is to say, whoa, hold on a minute. Well, let's remaster our existing games. And I'm kind of there for that. I mean, our existing Switch 1 games. And I'm kind of there for that as long as the pricing is okay.
Right.
And I think you're quite right. I think this is a marketing issue.
Exactly.
But the fact that it's not a kind of flat cost is going to cause consumer confusion, which means they really need to do a fantastic job of marketing this. Because on the face of it, the concept of a Zelda game being cheaper to upgrade than a Kirby game is going to cause some confusion.
I think in that case, maybe they could have done like maybe this is even more confusing, but have like, here's the graphical updates are $10 across the board in USD. But in some cases they've added full content, like major additions to the game. That becomes a different edition. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like they could have just had, here's graphics upgrades, it's $10 flat.
That's
and then anything else is separate.
Kind of what they're doing with Zelda, because you don't get the DLC, as I understand it. With the
Right,
Switch 2
exactly.
edition.
And I feel like they don't seem to allow that for Kirby, which has like the star-crossed world stuff, or all the new mini games in Mario Party Jamboree. Like that could have been its own separate thing. Like here's the full version for Switch 2 with all the content. And then here's the just graphics upgrades.
But I think they also want to gate that content behind the Switch 2.
I know.
So if you have the star-crossed DLC for Kirby, but you're running the Switch 1 version or the Switch 2 version running at like 1080p 30, is that really a satisfactory experience? I think it's just bizarre. But yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think that on the surface, from Nintendo's logic, this makes a lot of sense because, like John said, the additions to Kirby and Mario Party, they're bigger than in the Zelda titles, which are just getting like phone integration and frame rate boosts and resolution boosts and things like that. Nothing too exciting there from a gameplay content perspective. I don't personally have much interest in replaying Kirby again for another time, but the additional content certainly makes it interesting. But at the same time, I think this is a case of Nintendo doesn't do discounts, like a classic case of that.
Right.
So like they're gonna charge you what they think the resolution, the frame rate boost is worth, which is $10, and then 2 or 3 hours of new content, that's another $10. So they're basically going to charge you a price that they think is appropriate, whereas a company like Sony with Teardown Remastered or Days Gone or something, they're going to give you some new content, they're going to give you some frame rate enhancements, they're going to give you some graphical enhancements, special features, whatever, they're going to call that $10. That seems more reasonable to me. Or like in most cases, really, I think in most cases what we see with game updates these days is like you have a PS4 code or Xbox One code that's patched to run on the new consoles, and that's done for free. It's like when Ubisoft upgraded The Division 2 to run on current generation consoles with 4K 60 performance. They did not do that with a price increase. They were just happy to sell more units and get the game out there in terms of mind share, right? They were happy to do that. But instead, Nintendo is calculating that value maybe a little bit more exactingly. And the weird thing to me, and the part where I kind of get like a little bit almost uncomfortable, is the fact that there's no discount for the games as a package. So like the Switch 2 editions of Kirby and Tears of the Kingdom are $80 USD, aka, $60 for Kirby on Switch 1 plus $20 for the upgrade, or $70 for Zelda plus $10 for the upgrade. That's basically the pricing there. Or actually it's $115 Canadian, which is even higher than the $110 price for Mario Kart World. I don't know how they're pricing it out, but on some level I respect it, because Nintendo is representing that their games are a premium experience and they're not going to go on like a streaming service or something. But at the same time, it feels greedy and maybe ultimately counterproductive to like almost really penalize people who don't have that library already and just want to get into them. And now all of a sudden, Kirby was on my games of the year list for 2022. It's a very good game, but it's a 3-year-old title. And it's a very good game, but is it an $80 game in 2025? Again, Nintendo operates differently, but it feels a little bit odd. But the one positive message that I could make to end this is that not everyone on Switch 2 is taking the same approach. Like I noted the other day that Fast Fusion is only $15 American dollars in the eShop. That is a great deal.
That's an insane value. That's actually cheaper than Fast RMX, which was like an enhanced version of a Wii U game. This is an all new game, and arguably the best looking thing at Switch launch.
Yeah, it just seems really exciting there in that game. I mean, I'm sure it'll be worth $15. I'm sure, to me at least, it'll be worth a substantial amount more than that.
Did you see, Oliver, for the first time, Shinen has crossed the 3 gigabyte barrier?
3.7 gigabytes. So no buy.
For them, this may as well be 150 gigs compared to what they normally do, right?
Well, Fast RMX was like 800 megs, I think. Yeah, it was pretty small.
These guys are, technical wizards. I tell you, I can't wait to look at this.
Yeah, and I'd also say, just to close this out, third-party games are still mostly $60. The only third-party game that I saw that was priced higher than that is Cyberpunk at $70 USD, but that's the Ultimate Edition with the Phantom Liberty content, and that's priced identically to the price on PS5 and Series X and Series S. So that all seems very reasonable. So at least so far for Switch 2, it seems like Nintendo is operating in their own world of pricing. I don't know if they're going to get back down to earth or if they're going to start charging, exorbitant prices for games all throughout the generation, like especially with these Switch 2 edition titles that have that implied value add upgrade, that $10 or $20 of additional value that Nintendo is seemingly keen to price into their games. I don't know if that will change. I kind of hope it does. But yeah, Nintendo's taking a very different approach to other people in this industry, and it remains to be seen how well it'll work out.
Well, I certainly think it's going to work out in the short term because the kind of desire for the console is just gigantic. People just want it, and obviously they're going to need to buy games for it. The question is when it kind of moves away from the sort of hardcore Nintendo guys and moves more towards the mainstream, which is where Switch was so successful. The question is whether the pricing is still going to hold up there. I believe that's going to be.
I mean, who's ready for Donkey Kong Country Returns Remastered Switch 2 edition for $80? Anyone?
I mean, this is the sort of strategy that both Sony and Nintendo are going for here, because obviously you do have the cheaper upgrade pricing, but the point is that they don't think these, they're effectively library titles, as close as they're going to get to what you might call a forever game. And, people are always going to want those games, and they feel they can afford to charge full price for them, moving across the generations. And to facilitate that, they're just modernizing the games to suit the capabilities of the new hardware. And again, I kind of respect that. So, and it's all going to come down to the cost of the upgrade pricing for whether the people who've got the game already want to sort of upgrade it or not. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so this is something that John really wanted to talk about. Obviously, Switch 2, it's still using cartridges. Cartridges are much more expensive to produce than existing physical media, like optical discs, for example, Blu-ray discs. The size of a Switch 2 cartridge varies according to the the amount of game data, right? The more data there is, the bigger the cartridge that's needed, the more expensive it is. And then we have the game key concept, where it seems to be that it just enables, it's a physical product that enables a downloadable product from the eShop. And it looks as though we're going to be seeing a lot of those, perhaps more than anticipated. And John, you got concerns about this?
So first of all, it seems that a lot of this problem is centered around the availability of cartridges to third-party publishers in general. It seems that from what we can tell based on various information floating around, there's essentially only two options. You either take the game key card or you get a 64 gigabyte card, which again, people have surmised. I've seen some posts suggesting it costs around $16 a unit for the publisher, which is a lot to ask, I would say, especially if you have a game that is much smaller than 64 gigabytes. So essentially, we're in the situation where the only options offered to publishers are the small game key card or these larger 64 gigabyte cards, whereas the original Switch had many more options in between. I think there was like 4, 8, 16, 32, and 64 gig cards available, and publishers would choose accordingly. We need that to return. I don't know what the current situation is. I don't know why it seems to be so limited. There may be a technical reason related to the SD Express, sort of speed. Like whoever's manufacturing these cards, maybe they don't have the other sizes up and running yet. Who knows? But until we get those extra sizes, I think this is going to plague the system in a very bad way. So on the surface, I think the game card key is a much better solution than the code in a box that we saw more often on Switch 1.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is ultimately still a product that you can resell, you can move it around to different machines. It's not limited to one account. But it also essentially disables two of Switch's biggest advantages compared to other machines. First of all, obviously, the big one here is that it gets rid of plug and play.
Yep.
That was huge, right? With Switch, you pop in a cartridge, you instantly can play the game. Even if there's a patch, you don't have to download it. You can just play right away. There is no installation on Switch. That's huge, right? On PlayStation 5, Xbox, all the other machines with discs, even if you're completely offline, you have to install them, and it does take time. So the Switch was the one machine retaining that plug-and-play nature of classic console gaming. And Switch 2 does retain this with the main game cards, of course. The other thing, of course, is that this also requires an online element now. It seems you can play it offline once installed, but it ties the game to Nintendo's servers, so the game key card will only be useful as long as the servers are active. Nintendo's track record for that is not amazing. We'll see how that goes. So that's essentially the big concern, because most third-party games now seem to have opted for this. And if you notice, they are all priced significantly lower than Nintendo's games, which makes you wonder if it's not just Nintendo perceiving the value as being significantly higher, but also a situation where, you know, the extra cost of manufacturing is being factored into it, maybe. However, so on the Japanese pre-orders, we saw that pretty much every third-party game is a game key card. But Marvelous came around and did confirm at least that their games in the West, at least, will not use the game key card. They will be proper cartridges. So things like the Daemon Ex Machina sequel, for instance, does appear that it will ship on a real card. I believe Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk's an actual game key card as well. Is it game key card? Game card key? I keep getting that reversed.
I think it's game key card. Yeah.
That's making me think of Doom.
So, yeah, exactly.
What if these are the red? If they're red, we need some yellow and blue ones as well, maybe. So I don't know, man. I'm a little bit worried about this, especially if we're starting the generation this way, because it's kind of get people used to the way that this is, and it may spell the end of large availability of these sort of physical cartridge-based games that the Switch became known for. I think publishers will most publishers don't care about the online requirement at all. It's not that interesting to them. They're fine either way. But if they can save money and still have a retail presence, you know, they're going to be all in on that, right?
Yeah.
That's what worries me.
It's concerning because the obviously the whole concept of buying a game at retail is something that's almost endangered at this point. And if that's the case, if the volumes are low, then why sort of reduce your profit margin still further by getting a full cartridge out there? That's challenging, right? I also think that it's also a kind of mitigation of sorts. If you go back to the Switch 1 era, let's say you're going into your bricks and mortar store, you're buying a Switch game, you open the box and you get a code. I mean, that just looks really, really poor as a kind of consumer experience. This time you're opening the box and you are getting a cartridge. It's just that it's not a cartridge as you know it. It's still probably better than, as you say, John, just a code, a one-use code sitting there looking at you.
The one other thing I didn't mention, though, Rich, and this is a real problem, is storage space. If you're downloading these games digitally, the Switch 2 only has 250 gigabytes, I believe, internal storage. Yep. Then you need an SD Express card to expand it. It's not looking like you're going to have that much storage available, right? And that was the whole thing about original Switch games, is by having them on cartridge, you sort of mitigated that problem, because the game cartridges themselves did not take up much storage space outside of like saves and patch data. So having these game key cards, it's just going to eat up the same amount of space as a normal digital version anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oliver.
Yeah, this is really what I was worried about when Nintendo announced game key cards, because obviously I think it's a better product, right? Than you get an incomplete game on the cart and you have to download an additional portion, or even just shipping a code in the box. I think this is superior to those schemes. But what I'm worried about is legitimization, right? This has taken that bad practice, legitimized it with a cartridge option, but still allows those games to be used with a cartridge and traded, and kind of sort of looks like a cartridge in some ways, works like a cartridge in some ways, but isn't really a full cart. And now a lot of developers and publishers have a strong incentive to go with the easy and cheap route and put everything on game key cards. And so I worry that in like 6 months or a year, people are used to it, and almost every third-party game is on a game key card. Indeed, that already seems to be the case in Japan for the launch. I know in the West, yeah, we have Cyberpunk. We have a few titles in there, but the majority of third-party titles are on game key cards. Nintendo does not seem to be in that group, at least for now, thankfully. And obviously, I think about half of revenue on Switch 1 came from Nintendo titles. So that obviously matters disproportionately relative to the third parties. But I am worried that, like, 2026, 2027, we're looking at a situation where third-party games that are actually fully on a real 64-gigabyte cartridge will be the provenance of retailers like Limited Run or something, and there'll be special editions, and they won't come as a default option. That would be upsetting to me, because like when I do buy physical, I don't buy physical very often, but when I do buy physical, really for me the appeal on Switch is the ability to play those games immediately, have them on the cart. Like, there's no appeal really to a game key card for me, at least. It's not more appealing than just a game on my library that I don't have to swap out a cart for, really. So that's kind of an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, it's one of these situations we're going to need to follow quite closely to see how it actually rolls out. But the initial signs are certainly quite worrying, I think. I guess it's better than being an adorably all-digital product, at the very least. But you have to wonder whether this is going to persist into the next generation. Obviously, we don't have to worry about that for like 6 or 7 years, but even so, just have to keep our eyes on it. Actually, we got a supporter question here from Todd Weitzel. I mean, forget the anti-consumer nature of this. This is all about how it's going to affect the Digital Foundry workflow. His question is, with the proliferation of game key cards, we have to keep a library switch to consoles in airplane mode to compare launch versus patch performance of certain games in the future? Or have you all transitioned to the acceptance of filling hard drives with B-roll for future use? It's kind of like the second scenario, really, isn't it, Oliver?
Yeah, I've actually never, I have occasionally on consoles gone back to a disc version on like Series X or PS5 for the purposes of comparison, but I've actually never gone back to a physical cart on Switch 1 to compare an old patch to a new patch, and I archive all my footage. So if there's a new patch for the new Pokemon game, for instance, that supposedly fixes performance or fixes some memory leak issue where people have all these theories about it, I can go back and I can reference my original Scarlet Violet footage that I recorded 3 years ago. So that's what I typically do. And that's the general practice with most games. It's actually a rarity because obviously, for us, the games that we test are typically in a digital library. They're not physical games anymore. That practice ended a long time ago in games journalism. So in most cases, it's just going back to footage that we recorded previously and comparing that finished product in terms of the footage that we do have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking back to the old days where we used to get sent BDRs for PS3 and even sites, CDs and whatnot for prior generations. And that actually has served an interesting preservation mechanism because a lot of preview games went out on burnt media and they can be preserved. That's something you can't really do in the digital era. But even so, as I said, we'll be keeping an eye on that. But let's move on. Okay, so we've got some clarifications to do on existing coverage because new information has come to light. And where should we start on this one, Oliver? I think we should start on some work Tom has done based on feedback for Street Fighter 6 Switch, where prior to this, we only had very, very limited assets to look at from that Nintendo Direct. And basically, we said native 1080p. It's not native 1080p, but investigating how it's upscaling has produced some interesting results, right?
So basically, as far as I understand it, Tom originally pixel counted Street Fighter 6 as having a 1080p resolution on Switch 2, which it turns out was just the output resolution for 3D content because it does seem to count internally to 540p there. And indeed, when you actually look at those pixel edges, there is a certain characteristic that is indicative of DLSS among temporal solutions, which is that it has those curved edges. When you reveal an edge, it is a curved edge. And so we think that that is actually a title, interestingly enough, that's using DLSS. We believe that it may be using DLSS to upscale to 1080p, which is certainly intriguing to me because that's a 60 FPS title. We, as of yet, have not seen that, and this does appear to be that case. Now, interestingly, obviously, on the surface, that might not sound very positive, right? Because initially we pegged it as a 1080p 60 title. It's only a 540p 60 title, right? That's DLSS in performance mode, it looks like. But actually, when you compare it to Series S footage, That title on Series S has much more questionable image quality. Now, of course, with RE Engine, you do not have a great suite of temporal anti-aliasing techniques necessarily to pick from. It's not a great situation. But yeah, I mean, the Switch 2 version, even though it's 540p internal, it looks crisper, looks sharper, looks cleaner even in motion. Looks quite nice there. And I think that was Tom's impression. That was certainly my impression from reviewing his footage. It does actually look better than Series S in some respects. Now, it's missing some key rendering features from Series S, most notably perhaps screen space reflections. Those are not present. I think some other bits of environmental detail. So yeah, that is certainly a correction there. But I actually think in this case, the correction is actually a fairly positive correction in terms of this game's overall appearance. Yeah, I think it's good.
Mm-hmm.
Also, getting rid of SSR, I would argue, is a very positive thing in any RE Engine game.
RE Engine.
It's extremely distracting and ugly looking in every other version of the game. So that's a win for the Switch. I think the main thing it's missing is the muscle deformation system that was in the quote-unquote next-gen version at the time. So it's not quite there, but everything else about it, looking at this video, I definitely agree. It looks a lot sharper and nicer on Switch 2 versus the Series S version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, obviously, that Capcom decided to make that decision. And 540p is a very low internal resolution. But at the same time, you have to wonder what the computational cost of DLSS is there, which is possibly moving that resolution down. Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, Tom's comparisons here of the Series S version versus the Switch 2 is actually really quite revelatory. It does look as though there are higher quality textures on the Switch 2, which you'd kind of expect as it has more memory. But at the same time, It seems to be definitely having an impact there. And it's really sort of testament to why DLSS is a good thing to have. I mean, I guess there'll be a certain degree of sharpening in there as well, which possibly would have helped the Series S version. but even so, yeah, interesting stuff.
It's great. I think this is great news in general for Switch, by the way, because I think we're going to see some lower resolution titles, and the original Switch just didn't have a way to deal with that, right?
Right.
And now we're going to be able to get that increased fidelity of the more powerful hardware. But even if you're targeting these low resolutions, DLSS can help bring that image quality up to a place that looks probably very acceptable to even great.
Right. And the other thing, of course, is at the hands-on event, we didn't get to see the game running on handheld. So you kind of have to wonder what the solution is that they're deploying for the handheld version of the game.
Right.
If base resolution docked with the much higher GPU clock is going to be 540p, what are they doing on handheld? That was something from the hands-on experience that I still don't feel I've got a particular handle on. The gulf between handheld and docked. I still think that's a bit of a question mark. But yeah, that's Street Fighter 6 looking good. But we got to talk about Metroid Prime 4 as well, Oliver, because this is an interesting situation where we made a determination of native 4K resolution, but it was based on the direct aftermath of the Nintendo Direct, where the assets that we had access to were limited. Subsequent to that, better quality assets have appeared. And I think it's thanks to Lurig, is that the guy's name on the Discord, who did the heavy lifting on the pixel counting there on that higher quality assets, that we've got a better fix on that now.
Yeah, so for Metroid Prime 4, I think the game looks, like subjectively speaking, it's important to mention, like it does look quite crisp and even 4K-like in some respects. Like it's sharp, it's clean, it has some anti-aliasing treatment there, it appears as well. Unlike the other versions of Prime 4, which are very raw. So the Switch 2 version at 1080p 120 is a raw, no anti-aliasing image. Likewise, for the game, it appears at 1080p, or rather at 900p 60 on Switch 1 in docked mode. It also appears to run without any anti-aliasing treatment. It looks very much like a 900p title. And this also has a 4K UI. So in my earlier impressions, I pegged it as a 4K image, but on further reflection and after some better pixel counts of the higher quality asset, it appears to be 1440p internally. Again, with some kind of reasonably effective anti-aliasing, with some upscaling to 4K. And about that upscaling, I'm not 100% sure what's going on. Now, if you scale the image that's provided here to 1440p, it loses a lot of detail. It kind of looks like FSR1-ish, but with FSR1, usually raw edges are curved and rounded off more than we're seeing here. And it also doesn't have a super painterly look. So I'm questioning that, but at the same time, I don't think they're using TAA, based off of image breakup over time, it does not look like a TAA to me. So again, but part of the problem here is we only have about half a minute of high quality footage. And even with Nintendo's press assets, they aren't ideal. With someone like Sony, when we get press assets from Sony, they're these gigantic ProRes files that are many, many gigabytes. With Nintendo, their press assets actually aren't that high quality. We have a few 100 megabyte Metroid Prime file here, which is not ideal. And in general, their media production is not, I mean, this is a tangent, but their media production stuff is not as good as Microsoft's or Sony's. Like, when you look, they did a Hogwarts Legacy feature recently, and they had kind of like this mediocre video quality with lots of artifacts, and they had like stabilization in post, so they clearly filmed it handheld and then used like their warp stabilizer in Premiere or something to stabilize it. That didn't look very good. So I'll on this particular game, I'm going to refrain from offering too many opinions on its image quality from this point onwards before we have the final code. But I think once we have the final code, we can probably work out what it's doing much more easily. But I think, like, subjectively speaking, I still think it's like very crisp, sharp, good looking, just not native 4K.
Interesting, because obviously we're going from 900p 60 upwards, from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. Zelda, we had 900p 30 going to 1440p 60, but I guess that's just, you know, different games have different requirements really in terms of how far they can be pushed. Interesting.
Yeah.
But you're quite right. We did have quite a lot of material for other titles, you know, what with the Treehouse stuff that appeared in the Aftermath, which is something we don't have so much for with Metroid Prime.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up, Rich. It's interesting you bring that up because over the past few hours, I've decided to go back into our archives and pixel count the last two titles that I think we had some curiosity about, which was Pokemon Legends Z to A and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. And those were games that were much easier to pixel count than Metroid Prime, thankfully, for my purposes. So Pokemon Legends Z to A, I think you're seeing evidence actually in this title of some of the more conservative scaling that you're talking about there, because Pokemon Legends Z to A looks like it's running at about 1080p 60. And it does look pretty soft in the footage that we do have. But interestingly, the edges clean up a lot over time after being exposed. So I actually suspect they're probably using a TAA here, which is not too crazy, but the Switch 1 version, you know, it was 720p 30 with no anti-aliasing treatment. It looked like a pretty raw image, or very minimal anti-aliasing treatment if there was any at all. So I think that Pokemon fans will be pleased with that, but that is more conservative scaling, you know, 720p 30 to 1080p 60. Not quite as compelling as the Zelda scaling, I would say. But I would say one possible silver lining there is that at 1440p or 4K resolution or something with Pokemon, I think those flat building facades would look even worse. So I think that it might actually be okay that it's a little bit softer. I think that might actually be okay.
I think the solution to that would have been something like a nice depth of field effect for the distance in that game.
Could be, absolutely. That would have been awesome. I think that would look better. There's also Kirby in the Forgotten Land, which was a dynamic 1080p on Switch 1 docked, dynamic 1080p 30, going back to John's coverage, going down to, I think you counted a low of about 810p.
Yeah,
coverage
like
now. And this is even more interesting in terms of the scaling, because I was counting it out at 1080p 60 in the shots that we have, around 1080p 60. So that looks like there's some post-A in the mix, maybe some FSR1 for upscaling as well, possibly in the mix there. It does look more FSR1 to me than Metroid does, but that's a little bit more conservative. So I agree, Rich, you know, 900p 60 to 1440p 60 relative to like a dynamic 900p 30 to 1440p 60. Obviously, there's a bit of a divergence there, but there's an even bigger difference between these two titles and what you might expect, right? Because they're not scaling up a whole lot, going from going to 1080p 60 from their original pixel counts and frame rate metrics there. Not too amazing. So hopefully, I would hope that we see games fall more in line with that Zelda upgrade, because I think that Zelda upgrade going to 1440p 60 from 900p 30 was pretty satisfying, even if it wasn't quite the 4K 60 that we were promised from the Gamescom demos. Those always seemed a little bit questionable to me. I always thought maybe it was 1440p 60 and people in the room were just dazzled by it, right? Because you can never really tell that, if most people could not really tell the difference too much. But yeah, just a few notes there on some other titles that we did not originally comment on, but I do have some firmer counts on them. And the scaling there is not 100% what I was hoping for necessarily, but still probably satisfactory.
Yeah, a couple of notes for me. I mean, obviously they're being marketed as 4K. I think that's kind of should have an asterisk attached. That's sort of slightly questionable.
Hey, it's their first time doing 4K.
Right. Okay. I think the other point is that I don't particularly mind. I think there's a kind of divide between Switch and the other consoles because, you know, we are dealing with fundamentally different beasts. All I really want for Switch 2 is a system where I don't mind docking it and playing it on a huge screen. It should present reasonably on that big screen, right? I think going back to that Street Fighter footage against the Series S version, that's kind of mission accomplished, right? It's got a low internal resolution, but, you know, I can watch that comparison video playing out on my 4K screen directly in front of me here, and it still looks reasonable, right? It's just that was the issue with Switch 1, where I felt compelled to play in handheld, even if there was occasionally a performance penalty, simply because I just couldn't really stand a lot of the games as they played on a big living room display. I don't know what you think about that, John, as a owner of a similarly vast flat panel.
I remain concerned. I was thinking, so I have this whole thing where I use a scaler on the Switch to get that like 1080p to 4K nearest neighbor scaling.
Oh, nice.
And I was thinking, yes, with the Switch 2, I don't need to do that anymore. We're all good. Now I'm starting to rethink that because it doesn't really feel like we're going to be getting that much of a 4K experience. And it's also making me think that they messed up by targeting a 1080p internal screen as well.
Right. Okay.
I mean, look, when you play on the Steam Deck now, do you ever look at that and say, man, I wish that screen was way higher resolution?
No.
I don't think so. It looks freaking awesome at that size. And it would allow more games to hit native resolution if it were a 720p screen again. And instead, well, I feel like we're going to have like almost everything upscaled to that screen. So you're talking about Kirby, and one of the things that made that look so good on the original Switch is that you get that native 720p output on the handheld screen, so it was super crisp. And if handheld mode has to drop below 1080p now on the Switch 2, it could arguably end up looking worse because now you're dealing with LCD upscale blur, which is not optimal. So I don't know. I'm a little bit concerned about this side of things, the amount of scaling and the low resolution targets we're seeing.
Yeah, I actually think just flat out I would trade the Switch 2 screen for the Steam Deck OLED screen. Like
absolutely
any day, because even I actually think 720p or 800p or something in that range, I think that's an improvement. I think the HDR is much better. I think that obviously it being an OLED is much preferable. Losing VRR kind of sucks, but even still, I would take that screen. I think there was some question about exactly how effective is DLSS going to be in both the handheld and in dock modes. And I think what we've seen so far after some revisions here in terms of DLSS in obviously Street Fighter and in Cyberpunk is that it's very usable, it's workable. People can use it for, let's say, a 1080p upscale. That is pretty reasonable, but it's not going to get you to 1080p in handheld mode probably in most titles. They are trying it in Cyberpunk. I'm curious to see how well that works out. It's not going to get you to 4K, certainly in the docked mode. It's more appropriate for 1080p there, maybe 1440p at a stretch, although we'll have to see how that works out in actual games that might upscale to a resolution like that. So yeah, given that circumstance, I really wish that the internal screen had been 720p.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, with that, let's move on. Final news topic of the week, and I loved this one. Seemed a bit belated, though, for some reason, from a marketing perspective, but Sony has released a teardown of the PlayStation 5 Professional. No video this time, just a web page with some nice animated bits in it, but even so, gives you some idea of the creative process, the technical process in making a new console and the considerations that they have there. And what could I say? I mean, the thing that my first big takeaway from seeing the PS5 Pro was the fact that it was so small. And, we were kind of expecting a big hulking beast, but it wasn't. It was like slightly larger than the Slim. And this teardown gives you some sort of a more deep dive analysis of all of the technical decisions that were made in creating this thing, why it has those stripes along the side, those vents, and going down to like the new fan, stuff like that. Oliver, I'm curious on your take on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull out a couple details from this that I found interesting. So they talk a lot about keeping down noise.
Yeah.
And that's very appreciated. And that's been a trend for Sony this generation because PS4 had very substantial noise. PS4 Pro, man, that thing, after 9 years, it is a jet engine. It is so loud. But on the Xbox side, Microsoft has been doing a great job with like the Xbox One, the One S, the One X in terms of keeping noise down. Though my One X is a little bit louder over the years, I think that that emphasis from Sony with the PS5 Pro design in terms of designing like all the little bits of plastic and obviously the thermal assembly to keep it a very low noise solution is really nice. They also talk about the liquid metal side of things, which I thought was also kind of interesting. So one thing that is bound to be a little bit controversial, and this came up in earlier teardowns of the unit, but it's been confirmed here as to its purpose. They added grooves to like the little heat plate there, I think.
Yes.
To hold the liquid metal in place, presumably more easily over time. They kind of address it euphemistically here, but I believe that's its purpose. So that could be to address issues that we've seen on some PS5 units where the liquid metal pools to one side of the die over time. At least this is what people who do repairs in the console are alleging in some cases. I haven't personally addressed that issue. I don't think it's a widespread issue, at least not as of yet, but it could be a concern, and at least Sony seems at least open to the idea that it could be a concern here because they have added some grooves to hopefully hold that liquid metal in place. They also talk about liquid metal being important here because of denser lithographies that produce more hot spotty designs, which I thought was interesting. They did not use those terms, but they said denser lithographies, or they said denser processes. And that's very true because like modern CPUs in particular have a tendency to hotspot quite badly. It's basically, and GPUs as well, but it's basically a problem of dark silicon where you can make a really big chip, but you would exceed the capacity of any thermal interface material if you packed it just full of logic, right? So you have these bigger and bigger caches and memories and things like this to compensate. Here, it seems like with this thermal interface material with liquid metal, Sony is actually able to clock the console pretty aggressively, especially on that GPU, without running into hot spotting issues as much because they have much better connectivity between the heatsink and the SoC because of that thermal interface material. So that's certainly very positive. And actually, if you take the liquid metal out of the unit and you replace that with a standard thermal interface material, like a standard thermal paste, the unit will not work. It will only work in low power applications. That's something that people have uncovered through testing these PS5 units. They do not run without liquid metal on them, at least under any reasonable load. They need that really high quality TIM. Again, presumably because they're doing much more aggressive clocks, and it's designed around these constraints and parameters. So that's certainly very positive there. And then one thing I noted, the final thing I noted here, is that they keep comparing this unit to the current PS5 in their terminology, which is the 6nm slimmer version of the PS5. And that's somewhat telling to me because, again, it is very similar to that 6nm slimmer version. But if the comparisons were against the OG model, I think they'd be making the case that the unit is a lot smaller and lighter, and the heatsink is smaller, and power use is similar to that OG model, because the launch model was built around that 7nm SoC, and in some respects, I think it was also just overbuilt for the spec. Like, you did not need a heatsink that large to dissipate 200 watts off the SoC, and the subsequent PS5 builds that we've seen that have compromised a little bit in terms of heatsink size, made the unit smaller. I'm sure some of that has been the product of cost-saving measures. I'm sure that's quite likely there. Yeah. But there also does not seem to be any real compromise on the thermal and acoustic performance of the unit. And I think we're seeing that with PS5 Pro, where it seems like with a slightly smaller, with a smaller lithographic process there, with alongside this increased belief in the efficiency of the console and not needing to throw so much heatsink material in there, I think they're actually able to achieve a design that is very comparable to the current design, like they mentioned, but relative to that original design, it's actually quite a lot smaller.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're talking about an additional 40 watts of power that's required versus the existing model. So, it looks as though the die shrink isn't quite enough to achieve the sort of similar power consumption. I do recommend that you take a look at this article because there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of detail. For example, about the amount of screws and the placement of the screws is on the heat shield there is used to reduce the electromagnetic interference. I had no idea that screws could be that important to that, but apparently so. That's the sort of level of consideration that's going into the design here. I'm just going to go back to what I said at the beginning. The size of the end console, bearing in mind what this is doing over the original unit is quite remarkable. And actually, I've got here my own PlayStation 5 professional motherboard.
Ooh.
Just to sort of move it out of the range of the microphone there. And bearing in mind, it just takes me back to when we were talking about when the Pro released and the price point was announced, and it was all about what kind of PC do you need to build to match this. And, you think of this sort of hulking designs that came out, and then you get the end product from Sony, and it's this, it's a design this small. It's just absolutely fantastic engineering. It really is sort of minimalistic, efficient. And I also sort of have to tip my give a tip of the hat to Sony here, because you look at what Microsoft did with Series X, which is a really nicely designed console, but it is really sort of a complicated design, and ultimately Sony decided to stay with core basics that were similar to the PlayStation 4. One motherboard, and then how did they solve the noise problem? They just made a gigantic heatsink, which gradually reduced over time. But it just makes me chuckle when you look at that main board and then you think about all of those PC components that are required to get an equivalent performance. It kind of died off rather quickly, that whole discussion point, once the machine came out. I do actually think at this point that, once I've actually get around to finishing the 5060 Ti review, the 5060 Ti is kind of ballpark. That's the GPU that's ballpark to what the Pro is doing. But it's all about what you do with that performance, and that's why we're getting some really interesting results from the Pro there, including some like native 8K games. Obviously not non-native, but still 8K modes. But yeah, interesting article. I do recommend you check it out. Just kind of wondering what's next, because obviously we've got a new generation ahead. Looks as though it's going to be 3 nanometer. I'm not aware of the characteristics of the 3 nanometer node up against the stuff that's in the Pro, but it's going to have to be quite potent to provide a generational leap, which obviously asks further questions like, what is AMD's new architecture all about? But I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that front. But in the meantime, do check out this article. Okay, let's move on now to Supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week I ask on Patreon for our supporters to pose questions for the show, suggest topics, deliver some reactions and whatnot. We choose the best that we can and include them in the show. And we're going to kick off with this one, a bit inside baseball, but let's do it. It's from Struggling Shader. First of all, welcome back, John! ! You were deeply missed during illness and vacation. At the same time, Oliver established himself as a main member in the panel. So my question is for Rich, and about the management of the DF Direct itself. Do you plan on doing a rotation between John, Alex, and Oliver? Or is one of them losing the spot and giving me more time to work on other projects to become a backup direct member? That's a really interesting question, but typically who does the direct is who's available. And that's kind of tricky. Tom tends to work on a sort of firm Monday to Friday basis. So by the time Friday comes along, he really needs to sort of knuckle down and get his project done. That isn't really a problem for me. And it is really about, who's available and who isn't available. How logistically easy is it for them to break off from their current project to work on the direct? Oliver, you've actually been on the direct multiple times, quite significantly before John's sort of more enforced absence.
Yeah, I think this year I've been on every single direct except one. So it's a lot. Maybe that needs to change slightly. But personally, I think, I've always considered myself, a backup is needed to John and Alex, primarily if they can't make it.
No way.
Well, that's historically. Maybe that's changed a little bit. I've been on a lot recently. But from my perspective, it's just a case that because of my schedule and because I produce the Direct every week, my projects have a bit more flexibility in them time-wise, and I have to build my week around producing DF Direct, so I can often spare the additional, hours to prepare, a couple hours to prepare, a couple hours to do it, whatever. Whereas if, say, Alex has like a red-hot PC release that's come in super late, like almost every PC release does for Alex, and it has all kinds of issues and things to track down and stuff that he has to do to make a comprehensive PC review video. Does he really have time? Or if John is in the middle of like a 36-minute magnum opus covering like a new Sony first-party title, does he really have time? He might not have time, whereas I'm working on sometimes shorter videos, sometimes videos that are easier to defer time-wise. And oftentimes I do have a bit of a break in my schedule, just an enforced break in my schedule, because I already have to break for DF Direct every week, no matter what. So I'm happy to come on as much as is needed or is desired as everyone's schedules permit. But that's basically the situation at the moment, at least. And yeah, I just kind of come on when needed, as I'm sure other people can come on when they can come on. I just have a bit more give in my schedule.
Yeah, we never actually decided like who's on the lineup, right? Like there was no like official like here's the main members. It really is just like we were more available for it and just kind of fell into that routine for a while. So it's like whoever wants to do it and is available. Yeah. Anybody's always welcome on, I think, right?
Absolutely. I do like the idea that there is some element of planning involved here, because there really isn't. It's basic. What tends to happen? Everyone is so busy that, we're all doing our various projects. Thursday comes and it's suddenly, oh dear, we've got to record a show tomorrow. Who's going to be available? What are the topics? Let's get a quick post on Patreon out to our supporters to ask for their input. So it is kind of like we should probably do a bit more planning on it, to be honest. But it is basically who's available to come on. That's it.
This year was rough though for me, man, because February. I mean, I pretty much lost my voice for a whole freaking month.
Right? Yeah.
It was extremely frustrating not to be able to really speak normally for that long.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was very unpleasant, and it was painful too.
Yeah, and obviously people were thinking that I was sort of pushing you back into work when you're unwell. When that wasn't the case, it's just you were perfectly fine. It's just your throat wasn't there.
Exactly. I felt fine. It's just my whole voice was messed up still. So, and I wanted to cover stuff like Ninja Gaiden and all that. Yeah. I was like, oh, I need to cover this. So that was annoying. But then, GDC, and then I was in the US on vacation for 2 weeks, and I've just been doing a lot of traveling. And then, like I said, Japan starting next week, basically a week from now, although next Saturday. But I'll be bringing my gear with me. So
I'm looking forward to your new background. That's for sure.
We'll see what it is.
We need some sort of Tokyo skyline. That would be nice.
I'll see if I can position the camera that way.
Okay. Let's move on. This question is from Scud. Hey, chaps. On the topic of the Oblivion Remastered, do you think this is partly a testbed for future Bethesda games? Not just remasters, but mainline new releases. I'm wondering if they're looking for a way to focus their internal creation engine development on improving AI physics, etc. Maybe even finding a way to more effectively stream their worlds and eliminate or minimize loading screens. If they can trust the latest version of Unreal to push new features on the graphics front, then maybe that frees them up to focus creation engine development time on what makes their games unique, without investing massive amounts of time developing their own nanite equivalent, for example. Curious what you think, and hope you guys have a good one. Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because there have been examples where developers have done exactly that. I guess the first one that springs to mind for me would be Housemarque with Returnal. They took Unreal Engine and they basically, to a certain extent, made it their own. We're expecting to see similar things happening with The Witcher. I guess from my perspective, John, the question is whether this is a good move for Bethesda, because based on what I'm seeing with the Oblivion remaster, I kind of don't think it is.
So yeah, that's an interesting question, but fundamentally, the Oblivion remaster is still limited by the bones of the creation engine, right? Everything's still segmented up into different sections. And I think that was the primary limitation with their games at this point. When you look at Starfield, I would say that the rendering really isn't a problem. They did great work in terms of overhauling the rendering side of things. The game looks beautiful. That's not an issue. But in Unreal Engine, using it in conjunction with their underlying technologies they've done in Oblivion also has not solved any of those underlying structure issues, which is why I think that is the area where they need to pour the most research for whatever comes next, is sort of finding ways to create a more seamless world that is not divided up into these little chunks Although I will say I think Starfield was made worse by the fact that it had so many different disparate planets and areas, so it made it feel a little bit more split up than usual. It was less of an issue, I think, with the prior games where you're centralized within a single location,
Yeah.
right? And the loading typically only occurred when moving between interiors and exteriors. But still, I would like to see if they can find a way to unify all that. I think traditionally, maybe the problem has been that the interior structures didn't necessarily match the exterior design. You know what I mean? Like the space itself does not align correctly, and they kind of designed them separately. So designing them all as a singular cohesive whole definitely would introduce some new challenges into it as well, in addition to managing all of the different objects and the persistence of everything. So the way their games work does definitely create some challenges that I think most other games don't face. And even though the Unreal situation is interesting and how they were able to maintain the creation engine stuff while embracing the Unreal rendering side, it doesn't fundamentally fix the limitations, right? Plus, it's extremely freaking heavy, as we found, compared to Starfield, right? Like it hammers every platform pretty hard. So
Yeah. Oliver?
I'd concur with John here. I think in Oblivion it gives mixed results, where the graphics seem great to me, at least. I mean, I've only barely played it, but I think it seems quite terrific from everything that I've seen online. But in terms of the performance, it's really questionable. I think the console performance is in a bit of a state, and the PC performance seems very questionable. Outside of maybe like abusing frame gen and pushing that out, maybe you can get an okay experience. But in general, it does not seem to operate very well, especially on lower end CPUs. And Starfield is already, like John said, it's already a good looking game. And don't expect this is stasis for the creation engine either. They're going to push that engine further, I'm sure, for Elder Scrolls 6, presuming they do stick with creation engine for the rendering side of things. And I'm sure that if they went for Unreal, that, who knows, 5-year wait, 6-year, 7-year wait for Elder Scrolls 6 will be an even longer wait. So,
Right.
because that involves some adaptation and hiring more engineers and, doing a whole different process there. So I don't really know why they would need to switch. I think when you look at Starfield, it's a pretty good looking game. We had very positive things to say about it. Performance, I mean, it's not amazing in like Aquila or Jemison, New Atlantis, these places, but certainly in general, it's a much better performer than everything that I've seen from the Oblivion remake, and I think that's a positive thing. And I mean, again, I'm seeing no objections to the way that Starfield looks. I think it looks pretty great, actually.
Okay.
yeah.
Let's move on. This one, wow. Okay, it's from Mackie D. Video compression in Blueprints is very poor, and apparently Clair Obscur has issues too. Why and how is FMV quality still such an issue in the year 2025? Allowing for these two particular games having tiny developer teams and limited resources, is it really that hard to fit a decent quality video file into a game? Have seen much larger games having similar issues, and we were actually talking about this directly before we started filming this, because you guys have played Clair Obscur, and it is an issue that detracts the first impression of the game. And I don't think there is a particularly good reason for it in the year of our Lord 2025. I don't know what you think, John.
Oh boy, this has been an issue for a long time. I would say the biggest problem comes down to the codecs used and the file size limitations. But so the thing about video playback to remember, though, is that developers need to find a solution that is lightweight enough so that you can perform other tasks in the background, doesn't hog too much CPU resources or bog down the GPU, because typically when videos are playing, there is still stuff happening in the background, asset loading, things are going on back there, right? So it can't just play the video. That's where something like the BINC codec came in, because it's very lightweight. This was part of Rad Game Tools. Epic Games has acquired them. That's now known as Epic Game Tools. And I believe a lot of Unreal Engine games specifically, and others as well, leverage BINC specifically because it has a very low performance profile, or I guess basically it doesn't require many resources to run. But I don't feel like they've ever gotten quite a handle on the quality. It does supposedly support up to 400 megabits per second. on the bitrate side, but that also seems to result in rather large files. And at the compression level that we see in most games, I don't think the results are good enough. There's a lot of macro blocking, especially when dealing with low light sections, so like darker shadowed regions of the image. It just breaks up and it looks bad. In addition, Unreal Engine itself seems to create problems with video playback where it's unable to do so smoothly in many cases. This has been a problem with Unreal Engine since the beginning. Since Unreal Engine could play videos, it never does it correctly, I would argue. Going back to like the early Unreal Engine 2 days or whatever, like Warfare days, video playback has been a huge Achilles heel for it. And I feel at some point someone decided, oh, video playback's not important, but I disagree. It's still used in some games and it should be better supported. We actually found issues when working through creating RZ because we use videos with chroma key backgrounds. And that is something that Bink can support, which is cool. It has an alpha channel, although these games don't use it. But the consoles all handle video playback kind of differently, and there's just a lot of like depreciated support for this stuff that doesn't feel all that well thought out, which is why when you look back, I noted yesterday that something like Final Fantasy 13 on PlayStation 3 still has an FMV quality that is basically better than every modern game that you can look at right now. Like, it is absolutely flat out better because it is just it's leveraging Blu-ray format and like MPEG 2 compression, I guess. It's basically looks like a Blu-ray movie. It's extremely free of any sort of visual artifacts. It's awesome. And then you come 16 years later and you play in a new RPG like this, and the videos that they use for major story sequences, by the way, the emotional like impact of the introduction hinges upon these. They use much worse quality that doesn't play smoothly. So I think there needs to be some serious research and at least some work put into fixing this problem. There's got to be a way to play back videos better. We have so much power available under the hood now with this hardware that we're dealing with. I feel it's personally unacceptable to ship games this way, and it shouldn't even have to be a file size problem. Yes, more bitrate requires larger files, but we know that there's more efficient codecs out there. There should be ways to do decent quality video that looks better than YouTube, because Clair Obscur and especially Blueprints, they look worse than a typical YouTube video. There should be a way to do this, right? And I feel like just even asking people like us, come to us, like we deal with video compression all the time, and we'd have some ideas for you in terms of settings and getting this stuff actually encoded properly. Because right now, if you're going to continue to use videos in your game, they need to be better quality than this. Or at least if you're worried about space, make it optional, like have an optional download even.
Interesting. I mean, I think Final Fantasy was actually just 720p files. I think they were actually AVC. Not MPEG 2.
I think they were. I think the videos themselves were actually.
I'm not sure about
files. That. No, I believe they were 720p.
Yep.
Really, because the game itself was 1080p output, and it had like all that. Even though the 3D rendering was done.
Yeah, I think the files were reverse engineered for some time ago, simply because the PC version files were really, really bad, and people wanted better.
That's incredible,
ones.
then, right?
Absolutely.
So if they're really just 720p AVCs and they look that good, absolutely blowing away what we just see in something like Clair Obscur, that's pretty damning.
Yep. Yeah. So Oliver, you've been playing Clair Obscur, which by all accounts seems to be a remarkable game. But those videos, I mean, they're short-lived, aren't they? It's at the beginning of the game only for the most part, but it's certainly used for the most narratively important points in that first playthrough, that first part of the playthrough.
Well, that's what I would emphasize here, is that it's really just like the first 45 minutes of the game. And then after that point, at least in my own reading, all or the vast majority of the cutscenes from that point onwards are real-time cutscenes. Now, they're not perfect. They do have some performance issues on consoles, at least. They only run at a maximum of 30 FPS. I think that's shared across PC and consoles.
It is. Yeah,
so far I'm only playing on console. Although I will check in briefly on the PC code just to check that out, possibly a little bit later on. But I think with Expedition 33 with Clair Obscur, it's a little bit curious too, because it's not a huge game. I mean, it's a huge game in terms of its content, but in terms of file size, it's like 44 gigs, 45 gigs or something like that on consoles, on PS5. It's not huge. Surely they have some latitude to, have at least higher quality bank videos or whatever they're doing, right? Have higher quality videos in there. But they've chosen not to do that. So I think they should take a different approach. But in this particular case, most of the stuff's real time. Is it that big of an issue? Probably not, but they should still fix it, is my feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about this. I'm just thinking back to the Xbox 360 era, where there was a lot of video files that were being streamed from disk. And obviously, it's not just streaming in the video file, it's also streaming in game data simultaneously. So those were some pretty dark times in terms of image quality. So maybe there is a perfectly viable explanation for this in the current era, but I'm struggling to see it because, you've got like super high bandwidth and low latency storage solutions at this point. Video decompression isn't exactly onerous on the CPU, as far as I'm aware.
No.
You've got file decompression hardware for taking care of assets as they're streaming in the background. So, yes, I mean, it should be sorted out and, it should be sort of Death Stranding like, where, that kicks off with a 4K 60 video file on the PC version at least, and it transitions seamlessly to the game content, and you don't really tell the difference. I think that's kind of like the...
Actually, that's a good point, Rich. Death Stranding did have very good video quality, and it was it seems like an attention to detail we saw more from Japanese developed games, in fact, where they would tend to use higher quality video clips than the Western side. And this actually goes way back to, do you remember the original Xbox, PS2, GameCube era? Those three machines, the PS2 was the weakest of the three, but every game that had video clips, you typically got dramatically better video on the PS2 version, right? It was just leveraging DVD, MPEG-2, and then Xbox was usually BINC, and it looked horrible. And then you'd have GameCube, and then because of those small discs, they would compress it down to basically nothing, and they were virtually unwatchable. So there was just this vast difference in terms of video quality, even back then. And then it feels like developers kind of followed the original Xbox model of just crappy BINC videos with bad frame pacing, poor black levels, and artifacts everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. How do you... The videos are often used to make a first impression. That's why I'm getting so worked up. It's remember Halo Infinite when it launched? The very first thing you see when you hit a new game is this video clip that's supposed to set up the whole story. They got the black levels wrong. It was super washed out. The playback was wrong. It was not smooth. It had all sorts of visual artifacts in it. That whole sequence was basically ruined because you're sitting there wondering what the heck's going on? This seems broken. That's not good.
Next question, and this one comes from the Shadow Map. Has Sony effectively run the largest movement perception test ever done? Is the conclusion really this pessimistic? Since the PS5 Pro came out, VRR has been broken on the console in the vast majority of games. Outside of documenting this issue yourselves, there is shockingly little discussion on the internet around this. When I think about all of the minor video game stories that blow up in comment frenzies across the internet, this VRR issue doesn't rate. Puddlegate from Marvel's Spider-Man has carried more weight on the internet than VRR being broken on the PS5 for more than 6 months. Truly, it seems video game players do not care about stuttering. Thoughts? Interesting thoughts. Mine being that I do think that VRR is probably still a minority of the user base. I do think most people are probably on fixed refresh rate displays. It's probably my thought on that. And then it's basically the fact that the issue doesn't really manifest for 20 odd minutes. 20 odd minutes seems to be pretty normal play for the most part. But then it does kick in, and then it does kick in only on certain games, as far as we've been able to tell. So, Oliver, you took point on our coverage on this. Is this the largest movement perception test ever done? And is the conclusion really this pessimistic?
I'm certainly relatively keen on the idea that most people are not noticing some stuttering issues in games and in general performance issues in games. That's been my experience, that some of the things that we complain about are not often perceived by the general gaming audience. But I really, in this case, I actually don't think that's what's going on necessarily, because VRR is only broken typically on PS5 consoles, on PS5 Pro consoles in very certain circumstances. It's really games with unlocked frame rates running for extended periods. And if you have VRR turned on in the system settings, either turned on only on games that explicitly support VRR or turned on and enabled for all games in the system, if you have it enabled just to smooth out the occasional dip, it doesn't seem to emerge over any reasonable span of time. So the vast majority of games running by default, running with some FPS cap, should be fine. And even then, it's not every game with an unlocked frame rate. Of the games I tested, the split between games that definitely had issues and games that were definitely fine, not counting the ones that were a little bit ambiguous, that was like a 60-40, 70-30 split. So probably a majority of games, but not an overwhelming majority of games necessarily. So this, to me, it's an issue affecting the minority of users that have VR enabled in the first place, right? That's people with VR enabled, with VR capable panels that also have VRR turned on, maybe to apply to all games or just to some games. And even among that minority, it's only affecting people who play games that run unlocked and choose to go into those modes, generally speaking, because outside of a few titles like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, most titles are not kicking you into an unlocked display mode by default. They're letting you play at 60 FPS or 30 FPS or 40 FPS without an unlocked frame rate. And then even amongst those games, again, we're getting to a vanishingly small amount of the game playing hours on PlayStation, I'm sure. The Last of Us is affected, but God of War isn't. Why? I have no idea, but it isn't, right? So, your particular game of choice, your particular poison there may not be affected in such a bad way, but still, I'm hoping Sony does fix it. They should fix it. But it is an issue. I don't want to downplay it, obviously. People are upset, rightfully so. But I also think this is just the kind of thing that's only going to affect a limited pool of player bases with a certain preference for unlocked frame rates. Generally, that's what's going on with those players that you might have this issue. Most players will not run into this issue in their typical play on PS5 software.
John, I think actually the largest smooth perception test ever done is probably the PC gaming audience. Some of the stuff we've seen, which, which sort of brought about the whole hashtag runs fine on my PC counterpoint, which is like, you're talking rubbish, Digital Foundry, even though you've got, empirical data here showing an issue. That doesn't bother me, runs fine on my PC. But curious what you think about this.
I think it just doesn't register with everyone, right? Or even if it does, it doesn't bother them. They just think like, oh, little blip, and it doesn't, they don't think about it after that. And that's fine. But, to a point, I think it just, people are able to overlook that. And it's been variable in so many ways across the PC. Do you remember SLI?
Right.
Before the whole idea of frame time was really in the discussion. Right. People always used to call it micro stutter, but a lot of people didn't really notice or care about it. And like an entire generation was sold these cards for your power user that had this problem, like basically inherent to it. And a lot of users didn't seem to care or notice. So, I really think it is. If it bothers you, it's going to be very annoying, but I think it's as with anything, a lot of people don't notice these things. It's the same to some degree with things like frame rate in general, all this stuff. It's motion clarity. Obviously, I'm very sensitive to that. Most people don't seem to be all that bothered by flat panel motion clarity, right? Or even things like black levels. When flat panels became big, everybody was excited about going flat, and CRTs were discarded quickly, even though they had major advantages still. But people didn't notice or care. A large subset, or like the majority, even didn't seem to notice or care. So it's like, it really is just drilling down into this minority of opinion, the people that are sensitive to these things, that it becomes an issue. So even though we might be sitting here being like, how do you not notice this? This is horrible. Most people don't care. It just occurred to me, another great one, Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U.
Oh, that's horrible. The
59 FPS issue, where like every so many frames you get a blip, right? That drove me nuts. It's inherent in the game. It's always like that. Do you think most people noticed that? I would say no. People said we were crazy. Like, what are you even talking about? It's only 59 FPS. LOL. You guys are dumb. But when you actually look at it, if you can see it, if it bothers you, it's like a constant tick that's like always there. It's really bad. So
Yeah, fixed on Switch, of course, as well.
Fixed on Switch, yes.
Yeah, I think the final point to the question from the shadow map here is that Puddlegate from Marvel's Spider-Man was such that you could just produce a two screenshot comparison that showed obvious differences. And that's much more of a communicable thing to do as opposed to showing hitching and stuttering in a 120 hertz video feed, which you wouldn't have a 120 hertz video feed anyway. But yeah, that was part of the issue. It wasn't so easy to actually demonstrate to users, and it's far more impactful in person, obviously. Okay. Anyway, let's move on to the final question from Spodlude. Hello, gents. I feel that Alex was quite successful in bringing the spotlight to Unreal Engine's stutter struggle. I think the stutter struggle was kind of beyond Unreal, but I get his point. I was hoping you might make a bit of wake regarding Game Pass's irritating feature of not allowing games to be seen by the driver until Microsoft fixes it. This is a recurring problem for new releases for AMD and NVIDIA users enabling driver-level features. For me personally, it prevents me from enabling FSR4 on Oblivion Remastered. Anything you guys can do to publicize/discuss this irritation would be greatly appreciated by the community, I'm sure! ! Kind regards, Lewis. This is a new one on me, but it wouldn't surprise me because it does seem to be the case that, historically we've had situations where, for whatever reason, stuff like DLSS wasn't available in the Game Pass version of a game, but was available on Steam. And but this is a new one on me. So obviously, if there is a problem, it needs to be fixed. I'm kind of sort of slightly baffled by this concept that Microsoft is able to stop the driver seeing a game. I'd need to look into this. John, any thoughts on this?
I mean, my experience lately, I've been using the NVIDIA app more, specifically because I've discovered the joys of forcing the Transformer model DLSS4 with DLAA into older games for like exceptional image quality. It's awesome. But I do find like there's games that either just don't show up in the menu, or when they do, like I was like, all right, Clair Obscur, it shows up in the graphics app, but it just says configure in-game graphics settings and driver settings here, and that's it. There's nothing there. You can't actually adjust anything yet. And it's just weirdly random as far as which games show up in the panel, and it does seem to take some time before they actually appear correctly. So like for Elder Scrolls 4, I initially tried to add in the EXE myself, and that did not work.
Right.
But then, lo and behold, the next day, it's there in the settings.
Okay.
Anyway, so like, it does suck having to essentially wait on the someone to do something on the back end before you can actually interact with these games at the driver level, which was not really the case in the past. Although obviously there's always been like weirdness when you're adjusting stuff outside of the game that sometimes required like compatibility bits and whatnot, but it is annoying. So I understand their pain.
Oliver, this is a bit out of your comfort zone. It's not typically something you do. I don't know how many games you play on Game Pass on PC.
Well, yeah, I don't play a lot of games on Game Pass on PC personally. I tend to play Game Pass games a little more often on Xbox there.
Yeah.
But the reason why I don't use PC Game Pass so much is because the controller supporting the Xbox app is close to non-existent. I play with the pad on PC. I play it in a couch setting or in my bed with my monitor up on my wall, and I don't really play anything these days seated at a desk with a mouse and keyboard. That's for work primarily. I don't really game that way these days, unless sometimes I get in a World of Warcraft hole, and then possibly sometimes I do retreat back to my desk, but not often, and hopefully not too often. But I have had some issues getting the NVIDIA app to recognize games in the control panel for doing DLSS overrides and things like this. In particular, for me, I do like DLAA. I do like the Transformer model for improving games' image quality. But for me, my primary interest there is like the smooth motion frames thing that they've got going on there. Because I like using that for a few games that have locked frame rates. Like I was playing the Grid Motor, or what was it called? The Crew Motorfest on PC.
Yeah.
That is only a 60 hertz game. You have to use frame gen to get it up to 120 hertz or even higher. So yeah, I had a lot of trouble getting that to work with the overrides. I ended up getting it to work with lossless scaling, but lossless scaling has certain gamma issues with that game when you put it in windowed mode, and all this nonsense anyways. I don't want to bore you too much with those details. But yeah, that's my own personal issue with that. I don't really have too many issues with Game Pass, just because Microsoft is not making a good Game Pass product to use with a controller on PC. So until they change that, or until they let you add the games to Steam, I guess that would be another thing with the Game Pass games. But yeah,
They ain't gonna do that.
no.
Right. I think that's definitely something that needs to be addressed. And if there are issues that you have with Game Pass versions versus Steam versions, do let us know. We'll try and shine a spotlight on it, because it's kind of annoying, really. Game Pass Xbox should be offering a similar experience to all the other platforms. And if it's not, if it's actually inhibiting users from accessing features, that's a big issue, and it can't really be allowed to stand. Anyway, that was the final question of the show, therefore the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. And as always, please do consider the Digital Foundry Supporter Program. And early access to tons of things that we do, news updates from the team, and the chance to help shape this very show. But that's us. That's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry. And with a profound sense of inevitability, we will see you next week.